Helps if you turn the mic on. Good morning. My name is James. I'm one of the pastors here at Hope Church. And we've been working our way through a 10-month teaching series which on the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which we've called Rebuild. We called it that because as we look around today, we see a lot of churches and believers who are or have been deconstructing in areas of faith, searching for what really matters in following Jesus. We also see that God is at work too, rebuilding his church and bringing people to faith in Jesus once more. Here at Hope, we believe that by studying how God worked in the past, we can learn a lot about how to participate in his work today. And so through this series, we've been studying how God rebuilt his chosen people, Israel, after their exile in Babylon. So far, we've seen how Israel's rebuild was carried out by the leadership of people like Zerubbabel, who oversaw the rebuilding of the temple in the city of Jerusalem. And we've also seen how Ezra helped restore the temple and Israel's religious and worship practices, and also their cultural distinctiveness in a culturally diverse context. Today, we begin our study of Nehemiah, who will be an instrumental figure in rebuilding the walls of the city, the significance of which we'll explore as we move through the text today. So as we start to walk through the book of Nehemiah, I want to start this morning by asking you to reflect on a couple of questions. The first is, what is your vocation? Now, vocation is usually understood in terms of someone's job. It's like asking, what do you do? But the concept of vocation can include much more than just your job, because even if you don't have a job, you still have, in some sense, a vocation, a way in which you choose to spend your time. And how you spend your time is important because it says a lot about what you value and what you care about. In fact, what we do is often wrapped up in our sense of identity. It's the reason why what do you do is usually the first question we ask when we meet someone new, and we tend to make assumptions about the people we meet based on how they respond to it. So I'd like you to reflect a bit this morning on what it is that you give your time to. The second question I want to ask you to reflect on is, what is your calling? And while it's related to the first, it actually goes a bit deeper than what we do with our time. Calling has to do with how we see ourselves and our place in the world. It has to do with why we do the things we do. It has to do with our sense of purpose. And often our vocation is an extension of what we understand our calling to be. As an example, I've been watching Grey's Anatomy with my wife lately. And one of the things that these young doctors that the show follows are trying to figure out is their calling in the field of medicine. They each already have a vocation as doctors and wannabe surgeons, but they're trying to figure out which specialty is their calling, the thing that they were made to do. As Christians, I think we actually have a better sense of this concept of calling than the writers of Grey's Anatomy do. This is because our sense of calling is rooted in how we understand God's purpose and intention for our lives. Having said that, I recognize that for many Christians, it's a lot easier to answer the first question than the second. And I empathize with you. I spent the first 40 years of my life not knowing and then ignoring God's calling in my life. So if you haven't identified yours, take heart. But you know, just like those TV show doctors, you might be able to establish your calling by zooming out a little bit. All of them are doctors because they want to help people. That's their broader calling, which they're hoping to refine. My hope is that as we move through our study of Nehemiah today, we can find a framework around these concepts of vocation and calling that might help us to discern, at least broadly, what it is that God's calling is for each of us. Let's dig in together. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, and I get this wrong, Hanani, or Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. The citadel of Susa was the location of Daniel's second dream, and also the place where Queen Esther lived. And if you know their stories, you'll recognize that Susa is not an insignificant place or piece of the broader story of the Jewish exile. As we go through the text, we're going to see some similarities between these characters as well as Ezra, who we learned about already, and Nehemiah. But between Ezra and Nehemiah, we'll also notice some differences. And the first difference worth noting is found right here in the first line of verse 1. If you remember, when Ezra was introduced a few weeks ago, much of his credibility as a spiritual leader was established by his genealogy that went all the way back to Aaron, Moses' brother-in-law. But here, we're only given a genealogy of one, Nehemiah's father. And that seems to be included for the purpose of establishing that Nehemiah was in fact Jewish. Other clues, like the use of the Jewish calendar, the mention of Nehemiah's brother, help to frame his interest in the exilic community and the city of Jerusalem by connecting him to the Jewish people, and it helps us to understand why he cares about what's happening to them. They said to me, "Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." Now, the state of the walls and gates is not an insignificant detail, and it's worth noting that it could refer to the destruction left behind when the exile began, or it could be the result of the much more recent work stoppage ordered by Artaxerxes that we read about in Ezra chapter 4. What work had been started on the walls at that time could easily have been vandalized in the time since. At any rate, this report comes to Nehemiah at some point after those events took place. The reference to the people being in trouble and disgrace is also connected to the state of these walls and gates, and we can understand what that means by looking at a bit of context. In the guide for this week, you'll find more information about the importance and significance of walls in this region of the world and at this time in history. And I encourage you to dig into that this week. For right now, though, the fact that the walls and gates are not intact is a real source of trouble and disgrace for the Jewish people. This is because without walls, the Jews would be vulnerable to attack, particularly at night when thieves and other dangers might enter the city under the cover of darkness to do them harm. Likewise, the community would be in disgrace because without walls, they wouldn't be taken seriously by the surrounding peoples in the region. This is because at this time, a city with walls established a certain amount of status and credibility for the community living inside of them. Without walls, you were at best a settlement, unable to exert power and influence over the area around you. We have a modern equivalent to this when you think about how we compare large cities and urban centers to those blink-and-you-miss-it rural communities here in southern Ontario. It's fascinating how many people know where Woodstock is, and even more so London, but don't know Innerkip even exists, let alone where to find it on a map. So I think we can relate in some way to how Nehemiah responds to this news. "When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven." Here we see more similarities between Ezra and Nehemiah. Just 2 weeks ago, if you were here with us, we looked at how Ezra responded to the reports of Israel's failure to create and maintain separation from the peoples around them. Here we see Nehemiah responding in a very similar way as he hears about the state of his people and their city. Like Ezra, his first reaction is to sit down and mourn. The emotional weight of his grief after hearing the news is outwardly displayed in his physical posture. We're told that Nehemiah mourns, fasts, and prays for some days, which we will see at the beginning of chapter 2 lasts from the month of Kislev, when this report is received, to the month of Nisan, when Nehemiah has the opportunity to talk to the king about it. This means that he mourned, fasted, and prayed for at least 3 months. Now, I don't believe that his fasting, mourning, and praying was continuous throughout. As we'll soon learn, Nehemiah has a pretty important job in the palace of Artaxerxes, and history tells us that how he behaved at court would have had very serious consequences for Nehemiah. So I think it's best understood that Nehemiah remained in a state of mourning during this time, which included regular fasting and prayer. And the prayer that we're about to read is likely an example of the prayers he prayed throughout that time, or else a summary of them. But this prayer, as it's recorded, tells us something about why Nehemiah invests such a significant amount of time in prayer before doing something about it. Once again, as we go through his prayer, reflect on the prayer that Ezra prayed and consider the similarities between these two men and their ways of approaching a problem. Then I said, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. Note how Nehemiah, like Ezra, starts by acknowledging who God is and who God has said that he would be as the God of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We've not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Note how Nehemiah, like Ezra, identifies himself with Israel's guilt in this prayer of confession. He doesn't see himself as somehow exempt. Rather, he sees himself as complicit in the guilt of his people, even though he's not personally responsible. Also, like Ezra, Nehemiah knows his scriptures and understands his people's history and their covenantal responsibility toward God. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. Here, not only is Nehemiah remembering God's promise to restore Israel, but the reference to God's dwelling and name are a way of reminding God why this restoration should happen. This is because Israel, God's chosen people, and Jerusalem as the place where God's temple was, were understood by Israel to be the manner in which the blessing of God's presence and the example of what it looks like to live under his righteous rule and reign would be on full display for the blessing of all the nations. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayers of your servants who delight in revering your name. Now, you may have noticed that I've been highlighting the word servant throughout Nehemiah's prayer. This is because the concept of servanthood is an important part of how Nehemiah sees himself in relation to his God, and says something about the posture he takes before him. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. Notice here the distinction Nehemiah creates. Nehemiah has been identifying himself as God's servant throughout his prayer, and then he asks for God's favor in the presence of this man, by which he means Artaxerxes, the king of kings. In Nehemiah's view, the emperor of the world is just another somebody compared to the God of the universe, his God. Here, Nehemiah is stating the hierarchy of authority in his life, and it starts with God at the top and Artaxerxes at the bottom. And then there's this statement, I was cupbearer to the king. It's as if Nehemiah is saying, I'm a servant to the king, but I'm a servant of Yahweh. Earlier, I asked you to reflect on your vocation and calling. And I said that vocation has to do with what we do, while calling has to do with who we are. And it informs why we do anything. For Nehemiah, his vocation as cupbearer to the king was not an insignificant vocation. As cupbearer, Nehemiah would have had daily access to the king, multiple times per day, in fact, and the measure of trust that would have had to exist between them over the course of his tenure shouldn't be understated. As cupbearer, Nehemiah literally held the king's life in the balance with every act of service he performed. And just so we understand the scope of Nehemiah's role, cupbearer is sometimes also translated as butler, personal attendant, wine taster, security advisor, and so on. In any case, Nehemiah had, by virtue of his vocation, the two most valuable commodities in the empire: relationship with and access to the king. But because Nehemiah understood his calling to be servant of God, this statement that comes at the end of the chapter, which might be read simply as a biographical footnote or a narrative setup for what comes next, could be Nehemiah recognizing the opportunity that his vocation presented for pursuing his calling. Something that he may not have come to realize himself until he spent weeks mourning, fasting, and praying about the situation and the plight of his people. There's one English translation, the Contemporary English Version, that I think captures this sense of potential opportunity by its more narrative-focused reading of the text, which reads as follows: "Please answer my prayer and the prayer of your other servants who gladly honor your name. When I serve the king his wine today, make him pleased with me and let him do what I ask." I think what we're encountering here in the text, in this first chapter of Nehemiah, is something that is a bit of a pattern in the story of Israel, where characters like Daniel and Esther and Ezra and now Nehemiah find themselves in unique positions of power and influence because of their vocation. And God is able to use them in their vocations as instruments for his redemptive purposes, because these people also understood their calling to be servants of God. This is evident when with Nehemiah, because of that little detail we encountered earlier. The fact that Nehemiah spent 3 months mourning, fasting, and praying. But the question begs asking: if Nehemiah already had relationship and access to the king, why did it take him so long to act on it? I think it's because even though Nehemiah has the means and the opportunity to likely succeed in getting what he wants from Artaxerxes, it's still a roll of the dice in a high-stakes arena where losing often meant losing your head, which is another common thread between characters like Daniel and Esther and Nehemiah. And so instead of taking a chance by trusting in his own capacity, he waits. And he continues mourning, fasting, and praying for the one thing he knows he needs in order to guarantee success: favor. He needs God's favor to guarantee success. And so that he knows that he has it, he prays. And he waits. He waits for God to answer his prayer by presenting the opportunity to him. So what can we take away from this today? Well, I think there are a lot of things that we could pull out of the text, but I'm going to focus on this. Nehemiah was called to be a servant of God, but he understood that his vocation as servant to the king was not in opposition to this, but was instead something to be used in pursuit of it. What if we did the same? What if we understood individually and corporately that our calling is fundamentally the same: to serve God? And then we learned to see our vocations as people and as the church as the means and opportunity to fulfill our calling. And what if, like Daniel, Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah, we didn't rush into doing things just because we have the means and the opportunity in ourselves, but instead we took a posture of servanthood, praying and waiting on the Lord to show us the way of his favor, and as we pursue his will for our lives. Let's pray. God, you are great, and your name is great, and we want to give you glory. Lord, through your Son, Jesus, you have made your dwelling among your people. Through your church, you call us to demonstrate what it looks like to live as a redeemed community under your righteous rule and reign. God, forgive us for the ways in which we sometimes distort this calling. And forgive us when we neglect to serve you through the things that we give our time to. God, help us to know you more, to build relationship with you, and to lean into becoming more like Jesus every day. God, help us to slow down, to wait, and to pray as we try to discern how to do ministry, where to serve, and how to show love to our neighbors. In all these things and more, we want to honor you. Holy Spirit, enable us. We love you, Jesus. Amen. Tonight, we're having a prayer service at 7 o'clock, and I invite anyone that is able and willing and desiring to come and join us for prayer. Last week, I was sitting at home, I think it was Sunday night, and just reflecting on all the many things that our church family are dealing with. And I just felt that we needed to gather together as a church and pray. And then as the week went on, just the acknowledgement, the realization that there's a lot going on in our community and in our country and in our world. And just the desire to pray, to fall on our knees before God and just lift up the things that we're dealing with to him, and to seek his face and to seek his favor in our lives and in our church, in our community, our world. So if that's something that you want to be a part of, please come. As you go this morning, may the Lord bless you, may he keep you, may he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you, and to give you his peace. Have a great Sunday.